Hi everyone, I'm Brian Campbell, State Grazing Specialist for NRCS Pennsylvania, and I wanted to share our new tool for creating grazing plans. Um, it's called PennGraz, but you would find it in FOTG, Field Office Technical Guide, under Section 4 in the 528 Prescribed Grazing Practice. And it's not there yet, but it will just be 528 IR. That's where you'll find it. All right, so this is the replacement for our Pennsylvania pasture planning tool. You'll also find in the Field Office Technical Guide a new INE sheet that goes along with this new PennGraz tool, as well as a certification sheet. So there's the PennGraz tool that you use to create your IR, and there's also a certification sheet that you would use to certify the practice. And that will all be in FOTG Section 4 under the 528 practice. Just to give you a look, this is what the INE worksheet looks like now. It corresponds pretty perfectly with the PennGraz tool, so everything that you need for the tool you will be asked to provide in this worksheet. When you're new to planning or you haven't planned pasture much, taking this worksheet out can be a big help to make sure you capture everything that you need to capture during your field visit. And here's a look at our certification sheet. Again, the PennGraz tool that we use to create the grazing plan, which is the IR. They're all one and the same. The grazing plan is the implementation requirements. And this is the certification sheet that we only use to certify the practice. So it's only one page. You just write down the purpose, any associated practices that were needed with 528, any supporting documentation, pasture condition scoring, wildlife habitat evaluation worksheets if the practice is for wildlife, the grazing plan, which again is the IR, the cooperator's 528 record keeping worksheet to show that they actually did the grazing as we prescribed it, and a map showing practice location, etc. And then you just certify that it was planned correctly and that it was implemented correctly. So that is our certification sheet and our INE sheet. So now I would like to get into PennGraz, which again, PennGraz is to help you develop the implementation requirements. So what you print out of this worksheet pretty much is the IR. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's an instructions tab down at the bottom. And you can always start there and see instructions for how to fill out each of the tabs. And maybe a good place to start is at the top, just what belongs in a completed grazing plan. So you'll have your cons plan map, your soils map, WEG or wildlife evaluation guides or worksheets if your purpose is to benefit wildlife. And from this tool, you would print out the narrative, which tells the producer how to implement the practice, forage animal balance worksheets, and usually you do one for the current or benchmark situation and one for the planned situation that they will be implementing. If you wanted to give them some recommendations or things to think about down the line, you could do up to 4 scenarios if you needed. There's enough forage animal balance worksheets for up to 4 scenarios if needed. There is a tab to input your pasture condition scores. If you want, you could just skip that entirely and just throw in your paper pasture condition score worksheets. Either way, as long as pasture condition scores make it into the plan. There's the nutrient balance calculator that we use to evaluate do we have a nutrient overloading situation now that we need to address? Will we have one after we make all the changes we're planning? So just important to help evaluate, do we have that nutrient transport resource concern, especially important for water quality. And then finally, there is a record keeping tab. That is going to be a blank worksheet that's for the farmer's use so that they can record what they've done. There's also a table of just helpful information. Average dry matter intake rates, depending on animal class. How many growing days do we have in different parts of Pennsylvania? How do I convert forages on a wet matter basis or as fed basis into dry matter so that I know how much dry matter is actually there? If I wanted to know the standard animal weights that Act 38 uses, I could click this link. Usually we want to use the weights that the producer has on hand, that they know their animals weigh roughly these amounts. But if you forgot to ask or you want to use standard weights for some reason, you could find them here. And then the remaining two tables have to do with the nutrient calculator. And these two final tabs are just data that the workbook pulls from as we use drop-down menus. So that's what's in a grazing plan: conservation plan map, soils map, wildlife habitat evaluation guides, the narrative, forage animal balance, PCS, and nutrient worksheets, along with a record keeping page for the producer. There's an instructions and a link over here about how to create that soils map so that you're getting all the information you need, not just showing the soils that are there, but getting forage yield estimates out of Web Soil Survey. So that's all explained here, just 4 steps. It's pretty easy. When we're saving this workbook, we always want to use save as so that we're not overwriting the template. We're trying to keep this template blank so that you can use it again and again. But if you ever forget and you save on top of this template, just go back to FOTG and download a fresh copy. And I'll say, if you're ever running into issues with your template, a good place to start is usually to go back to FOTG and download a fresh copy of this workbook. That's usually will address a lot of issues if you run into any. All right, to export and print this workbook, you go to File, Save as Adobe PDF, and you would select the worksheets that you want. So that would be the ones in green here at the bottom: narrative, any of the forage animal balance worksheets, pasture condition score tab, and nutrient balance calculator tab, along with the record keeping worksheet for the producer. So you'd check each of those boxes, select convert to PDF, and then a PDF gets created, and you'll have that to print out to provide to the producer and to save into Conservation Desktop. Again, you wouldn't just jump into this tool. First, you would go out and have your field visit. You complete your inventory and evaluation, as well as grab your pasture condition scores for those pasture fields. Sometimes our producers are grazing cropland, so that's a good thing to keep in mind, that if you want to prove that there's a soil health resource concern on any grazed cropland, you would also need to bring along your Cropland Infield Soil Health Assessment Worksheet, which we call IFSHA. But you'd want to make sure to bring that along if you want to prove you have a soil health resource concern on pasture. But again, all your normal field visit stuff before you jump into trying to complete a grazing plan. All right, so you've got these worksheets. This is the instructions tab. The narrative tab is where you're going to describe how prescribed grazing should happen on that operation. Again, you've got your forage animal balance worksheets. They will show your yearly forage supply, your yearly forage demand, and the balance between those two things. It will also give you some calculations about the operation as a whole, as well as how you might want to break up your pasture into paddocks. Pasture condition score worksheet. If you're scoring anything less than a 30, then you need to go in back to your narrative and figure out, how am I going to address this? Because we can't just leave it below 30. We need to figure out, how am I going to improve my pasture conditions. And then finally, your nutrient balance calculator, which a lot of that information will be fed into it from the forage animal balance worksheet, so you're not having to duplicate data entry. I tried to minimize that as much as possible, but that would show you do or do not have a nutrient transport issue, nutrient overloading issue on those soils. And again, your blank record-keeping worksheet for the producer. So let's take a look at those things. Two things to note. Anytime you see a yellow cell, that means we're expecting data entry. So you do want to enter the producer's name and address and phone and county and your name. Design certifier. Just a reminder to you that anyone can write this plan using this tool, but in order to qualify as an NRCS plan, it needs to be approved by someone with appropriate job approval authority, JAA. So that's just a reminder to you to make sure that someone with appropriate JAA is approving this plan, that it meets the practice standard. And as soon as I enter my address, then that cell is no longer yellow. That's a helpful reminder that, hey, this is a spot I should be entering text or numbers. And then second, anytime you see one of these red triangles, that means I've added helpful instructions for what we expect, or what you can expect when you enter information in those cells. So this is a reminder that anything you put into this contact information section will automatically transfer to all the other worksheets, so you don't need to re-enter over and over. Notes. I might want to mention the track number. And I just left a little note here that if you ever want to create spaces in a cell, all you do is hit Alt and Enter, and it will take you down so you can create some space if you need to. So Alt Enter will create some spaces in that cell. Right, so in a lot of this workbook, there are drop-down menus. Try to make this as easy as possible. You obviously need to have a purpose for writing the plan, which basically relates to what resource concern or concerns am I addressing. You can see here just a reminder that we're using drop-down menus, and these are the current purposes for 528, prescribed grazing. And if I get one, then it's no longer yellow. I know I've entered text there. I'm good to go. Always a good reminder, anytime we put a purpose in, it means we need to meet that purpose. So if you're trying to make your life easy, pick one purpose. If you're trying to truly address a bunch of resource concerns, put them all in there and make sure that the plan you're going to implement is going to address each of them. All right, and just like in our previous pasture planning tool, there are some text boxes here that you're going to need to enter some farm-specific information in. But you're not left in the dark. Again, if you just scroll over, it will show you exactly what's expected in this text box. So describe the forage and livestock that are there, describe the current grazing system, and the existing practices. Very similar. Producers' goals, what do they want to achieve? And a lot of times that will mean how many animals do they want to grow the operation to? Are they thinking of adding another species? Would they like to be an all grazing operation? All these things that might be a producer's goals. Sensitive area management. Where are those sensitive areas? What are they? And how should they be managed in order to address any resource concerns? We need to address those. We can't just ignore them. And then other resource concerns. So if your pasture could use some legumes, that's not really a sensitive area issue. So it would go down here. So if I'm going to interseed clover into the pasture, again, that would go down here. Any issues we identified with the pasture nutrient calculator, that tab down here, or any issues we identified with our pasture condition scores, right here, we could make sure we explain how those are going to get addressed in this text box. Management requirements spells out for the producer exactly what we're expecting. You are able to edit this. Hopefully, if you do edit it, you'd have a good reason to edit it, because I think this should be pretty standard across any 528 plans. But if you may edit it if you decide that's what's needed. Our practice implementation schedule shows all the practices that need to be implemented along with 528 in order to address the resource concerns on pasture. And you'll see if I scroll over here, I'm expected to list practices that are directly related to grazing or they're located on the pasture. Anything that's totally irrelevant to pasture would not go into this grazing plan. And you can see this is a drop-down menu. I have a lot of pasture relevant practices here. I just select one. Any notes, what field it's in, and how many or how much is planned. So you can add a lot of practices if you need. Almost the entire rest of this tab is a standard narrative. This is what you producer should know about grazing in Pennsylvania. Soil health, forage quality. But there are two more spots we do enter data, and this is one of them. So for each of our pastures, we want to select a primary forage that we're going to be managing for. It's impossible, or it doesn't do well to try and manage both for the white clover and for the tall fescue. You're going to manage for one or the other, and that's kind of the producer's goals and what you would recommend as the planner. A lot of times we want to be managing for our perennial grasses. That's really what we're after. So I might come down here and say I've got orchard grass, but maybe I also have a field of native warm season grasses, and maybe I also am grazing corn stalks after harvest. So now the producer has all the information they need about our expectations of start and stop grazing heights. Again, more standard information that might be helpful for the producer. And then finally, there is a standard narrative about contingencies, what the producer can do if they run into issues. And then here's a place for you to add more information. So that is the narrative tab. Like I said before, we can do up to 4 scenarios for the forage animal balance worksheets. Usually you'll just be doing 2, the current or benchmark scenario in this first box, and then in forage animal balance number 2, we would do the planned scenario. And you want to be very explicit about what's going on. Just make it so that anyone that's looking at this plan would understand what they're looking at. So if I write benchmark, anyone that looks at this plan now will know that this is the benchmark situation. If I go to this next one, I might get into more information. So planned, we're planning on interseeding clover and intensifying the grazing rotation. So that's very clear to anyone who's reading that, why things look different here than they do on the benchmark. You can lump fields together if they have the same forages. So I might have fields 1, 2, and 5 that all have that orchard grass. So this is a drop-down menu. Come down and select orchard grass. If I think this is too high or too low of a forage yield estimate, I can correct that here. Let's say field 3 was our eastern gamma grass, that native warm season grass, and field 4 is that crop field that we're grazing corn stalks on. So I would come down here and select corn stover. Now I've got those estimates. You enter your acres. The average rotation quickness or intensity, so how often are they rotating on average? So could be as little as a few times a day. It could be that they are continuously grazing. If they're continuously grazing, you would select one of these. So either high density, we have a lot of animals on the pasture, maybe a 1-to-1 ratio of animal units per acre, or low density, there's several animals, but on a lot of acres, maybe 2 acres per animal unit. And so we might select low density where weeds are growing, there's over-mature forages, and that really impacts it really only impacts the grazing or harvest efficiency. So if I select 3 to 4 days I'm rotating, I've got a 65% harvest efficiency. That 65% of what's growing is going into the animals. If I go down to moving every 2 weeks, then that's down to 45%. It might be that you want to represent, hey, I've got a hay field. I've got an alfalfa hay field that's helping feed these animals. So I might throw that in here. And in that case, that's not getting grazed. So I would come down here to the bottom and select for hay only. It's not grazed. If it is grazed, I'm going to select how often they're rotated. And then multi-species herd. Again, you can scroll over any of the things with the red triangle to find out what's expected. But a multi-species herd is more than one species of livestock graze those acres, those fields. And if I select yes, then my harvest efficiency gets bumped up by 10%. Yearly forage demand. I'm describing the animal group. It could be steers, cow-calf pairs, a bull, whatever it is. I'm using a drop-down menu to select the animal type. And again, this is just to give you your dry matter intake. It does not affect anything else. So, steers, those are growing animals. Cow-calf pairs, mature females, and my bull, mature males. You can see we had dramatic enough differences in dry matter intake for these species, so they got their own line item in the drop-down menu. If you're dealing with dairy animals in lactation, and that's the only time they're grazing, you could select that, and that would bump you up to 4% dry matter intake per day. But you can change any of these. If you say, I've got goats and they need more than 4%, they need 5% dry matter intake per day, you would just enter that and that would override what automatically got entered. You do your average weight per animal, ideally from the producer, but you could use standard animal weights from the Act 38 program. number of animals, grazing period, so start month and stop month. If I enter January, it's going to assume we're starting January 1st, and the end month goes till the end of that month. So if I did 1 to 2, that's going to be 60 whole days, maybe 2 whole months. So January 1st to the end of February. And this does round up. So 365 and a quarter every year, days in a year. That rounds up to 366. Are my animals getting supplemental feed? And we want to input that on a dry matter basis. And like I mentioned in the lookup tables, I can go to this table and I know what the producer told me, how much they're feeding, and I just multiply by this reference number in order to find out the dry matter basis. So if they tell me each animal's getting 2 pounds of grain per day, I would just go to dried grain, multiply that by 90%, and I'd find out my dry matter basis. So whatever it is, 1 pound a day, that's going to decrease the amount of grass they need on those pastures if they're getting fed a pound a day. I'll show you an example on another worksheet, but below it gives you a graph of forage demand and forage supply month by month, which I think is super helpful. You get some overall calculations for this scenario specifically. And then if I go in here and I enter how often I'm rotating, if it's every 5 days, then all this gets calculated as well. And I'll show you that in an example worksheet. So got our benchmark situation, our planned situation or scenario, 2 other scenarios if you really wanted to get in depth or show the producer some more options. Pasture condition score worksheet. See, we have drop-down menus if needed. It's a lot easier just to enter the numbers. Wind erosion, not usual in Pennsylvania, we would select not applicable. Again, all this contact information would be drawn from your narrative page. You are welcome to group fields together if their management and composition is the same. So it could be that this is fields 1, 2, and 5, again, those orchard grass fields, and then our acreage. You do this for each field or group of fields. And then down at the bottom, we get a summary and then an explanation of what those scores mean. So for each individual indicator, if my wind erosion score is at a 1, I really need to address this. If my total score is a 25, there are some things I could improve. This nutrient balance calculator, again, I'll show you an example in a second. But here's an explanation of how to use it, what it means. When to use it is maybe the bigger thing, when to use it. We do not use it, or we only use it on pasture systems that have a stocking rate greater than 1 animal unit per acre and no mechanical applications of manure. So we're assuming the manure that gets put on that field is solely coming from the animals that are grazing. You can include commercial fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, that you know how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is in that, and you would just enter that here. Planned fertilizer nitrogen, if it's 50 pounds an acre, we'll go in here. Planned fertilizer phosphorus and potassium, if you have a producer that's fertilizing their pasture with commercial fertilizer. And then the record keeping worksheet for the producer. Again, their name, county planner are all going to be automatically filled in. You can feel free to fill this information in for them if you'd like. The field tract, farm tract, and field numbers, where 528 is planned and where they're expected to implement it, as well as the planned acres. And then they would go through over the grazing season and fill out this worksheet. So let's go ahead and look at an example. Simple example, we have contact information, purposes, a cow-calf operation, a bull is confined except during breeding, they purchase hay from a neighbor. They do have access to a shallow stream in the pasture where cattle like to hang out, and we're saying, hey, we're going to need to exclude that from the pasture. The producer would like to decrease their hay expenses, and we think it's a good idea to add some legumes to that pasture. Here's some things we're doing. We're addressing some pigweed in the pasture, adding some waterers to make prescribed grazing or rotational grazing more possible, some fence to divide the pasture into 4 paddocks, additional fence to exclude cattle from the riparian area, interseeding some clovers over the winter, and again, our primary practice, 528 prescribed grazing, we're going to start rotationally grazing on these acres. And that rotational grazing will be based on our start and stop grazing heights. So getting in there and getting out of there at the correct heights. Estimated recovery days, not that important. What we expect from the producer is, hey, I don't care what happens to those animals. I don't care where you put them. If they need to be sold off the farm, we expect to start grazing at a certain height to maximize forage quality for the animal, and to stop grazing at a specific height to make sure we always have adequate cover. We're maximizing soil health. We're maintaining that solar panel of the grass so that it can recover quickly and keeps our soil covered from erosion, as well as addressing nutrient runoff. And then finally, our contingency plan. In addition to the standard, I just said, hey, producer, it's probably a good idea to identify another source for purchasing hay in case there's a shortage. And anytime there's a forage shortage or where soil is excessively wet, the cattle will be confined to the barnyard and fed hay. So currently, the pasture is a mix of Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. So I just entered mixed cool season grasses. I thought that what came up with the drop-down menu was a little low for this pasture, so I upped it. 52 acres. We have continuous grazing going on. If I come down here to my animals, I've got my cow-calf pairs, steers for grass-finished beef, and a bull. Number of animals, their weights. I mentioned that bull is confined except during breeding, so he's only out there 2 months of the year. These are not fed any supplemental feed. And if I come down here, I can see a yearly forage supply, yearly forage demand, and the difference. I'm needing to buy 134 tons of hay each year to feed these animals. And month by month showing, hey, in spring I'm almost getting there, I'm getting closer, but summer slump and then all through the winter, I just am not coming close to meeting my animals' forage needs. If I come down here, I've got my overall calculations for the scenario, as well as it's continuous grazing. I just threw in 365. There's never a rotation, so it doesn't necessarily apply here, but it will apply when I come to the next tab. The next tab, I think that my grazing stop height of 4 inches will benefit the tall fescue, and that eventually that's going to outcompete the Kentucky bluegrass. So it's going to be more of a tall fescue pasture. That bluegrass is going to get outcompeted as we start grazing better. And I'm going to be interseeding clover. So I mentioned that before. So my scenario says, this is my planned scenario: begin rotational grazing, exclude cattle from stream, herbicide that pigweed, and frost seed legumes. So that's where those clovers come in. Instead of 52 acres, now I'm down to 49 because I got rid of some acreage when I kicked the cattle out of that riparian area. I'm going to encourage the producer to start by rotating once a week. So my drop-down menu every 7 to 10 days. I guess I'll just mention here, if you do have an animal concentration area, which is pretty much anything that's consistently grazed below 3 inches, you've got options here. A vegetated exercise lot, whatever it is, you do have options here. You also might run into some weird stuff. Got brassicas, annuals, so millet, Sudan grass, oats, triticale, wheat. Those are all in here. If you have someone who's double cropping their pasture, so they're planting Sudan grass in the summer and they're grazing it down, and then they're planting a small grain in the winter and grazing that down, we have 2 options. So again, this is not perfect. We're picking whatever's closest. So if I'm double cropping, I've got millet and annual ryegrass. So my summer annual and my winter annual, and I'm grazing them as pasture. That's here. That's an option. And then the other option for that is Sudan grass and rye. Also, I have options for not just tall fescue, where they're just grazing it like any other cool season perennial, but we all know that tall fescue does excellent at stockpiling, so not grazing it over the late summer so that it can be grazed into winter. So that's an option here, and that will change your forage availability curve. And then all kinds of winter small grains. All right, so my animals have not changed, but because I've increased my forage yields and my forage utilization, because I'm rotationally grazing now, instead of needing 130 something tons, I now only need 95 tons of hay over the course of the year. And look, I actually have adequate forage in the spring, so that's nice. I've definitely met my one resource concern up top, which was to improve the quantity of forage for grazing. So I've definitely improved my quantity. I'm addressing that resource concern, not perfectly, it's not, but I've absolutely improved forage quantity. If I come down here, I have some overall calculations for that scenario, as well as, again, I decided rotating once a week is probably what's practical for this producer, and that gives me some good information. Like if I'm rotating every 7 days, 8.25 acres is really what's needed for those animals at a minimum. And that's really helpful information if we're trying to design a paddock or a rotational grazing system from scratch. I decided to throw in a third scenario here, so I've got my benchmark situation planned and now a recommended one, so that this is what I'd recommend you be thinking about down the line. So do what we planned, but also intensify the rotational grazing with temporary fence. And that would just get us to moving every 2 days and just showing the producer what that would do for his or her forage animal balance. And so instead of needing 95 tons, now I've decreased that by over 20 tons of hay I need to buy. Anytime there's a negative number here, this shows up and it just tells the producer, hey, your yearly forage balance is negative. That means you're going to need to buy or find forage. Your pastures are not producing everything you need. And again, because I'm down to 2 days, I entered 2 here. And if I'm moving every 2 days, then my paddock sizes would be about 1.8 acres per paddock, and I'd be doing that using temporary electric fence. I only had one big field currently because they're continuously grazing, just those 50-something acres. So I entered that here in my pasture condition score tab. Scroll down, I've got my summary. Okay, we didn't look at this on the blank worksheet, so let's look at it now. The pasture nutrient balance calculator. A lot of this information is imported from each of your scenarios. So hopefully that will save you a lot of data entry. Yeah, so again, yellow tabs mean I need to enter some information. Penn State does not provide manure values for every single animal type in the world. So if you'll remember, animal group 1 was cow-calf pairs. So I'm going to come down here to my beef, cows, and they've got solid manure. And if you ever have questions of what does all this mean, is there any additional information I should think about, you can go to the lookup tables, scroll down to the very bottom, and that is our manure table. So here on the very right, there's just additional notes. And you'll see sometimes it'll say, use these analyses for estimating nutrients deposited on pastures. So whenever you're talking about pasture, those are the numbers we want to use. All right. Cow-calf pairs. Closest thing is solid cow manure. Number 2 was our growing animals, our steers, and those solid manure finishing cattle. That's as close as we can get there. And then our bull, our bull that's penned up for most of the year. There's nothing that close, so I'm just going to go ahead and select solid manure cow. Close enough. Hours per day on grazing acres. So this is a beef operation, in this case, 24 hours a day. They're out there. You can imagine horse or poultry operations where that's not the case, but in this case it's 24 hours. You'll see our bull is only out there for 2 months, you might remember, but when he's out there for 24 hours a day. This is scenario 1, and this also gets pulled over from your forage animal balance worksheets. And in this scenario 1, we have 52 acres that are grazable. That gets pulled over. This producer is not applying any commercial fertilizer to their pasture, so I could enter 0, which just shows a blank. Residual manure. I want to scroll over here and see that I'm putting in the right value. So if it's rarely received manure in the past, we're putting 0. If that pasture's continuously received manure in the past, so in this case they've continuously grazed it, it's definitely continuously received manure, so I'm entering 35 like it says to do here. Nitrogen availability factor is automatically entered as 0.2, but if you're just talking about poultry, it is just pastured poultry, you would do 0.15. But for almost every plan I can imagine, it's going to be 0.2. This big yellow box tells you what a negative number means. If you've got a negative number in the balance, it means you're depositing too much of that nutrient. Your forages are not taking up as much as is getting deposited. If you know the current value of urea, of phosphate, of potash, you can enter those here, and it's optional, but it will just give you a value here. That's the value of the manure that's getting applied. So that's a lot of money in nitrogen that's getting applied to those pastures. And could I be applying that elsewhere on the farm, or could I be applying it better through rotational grazing, intensive rotational grazing? So you can see in our baseline benchmark scenario, we are over applying nitrogen, phosphorus, but not potassium. If I come down here, I've already entered that information, but in this scenario, we've started rotational grazing, excluded cattle from the stream, so that means our acres are less. And because we're rotationally grazing and we've interseeded legumes, our forage yield has bumped up. Because of those two things, now we are perfect. We're doing great on nitrogen. We're almost exactly balanced. Our forages actually probably could use a little commercial potassium because they're taking up more than is getting deposited by the animals. And we're still a little over on phosphorus, not a huge deal, but we're not way out of line as far as being close to balanced. Scenario 3, what if you move every 2 days? We're in the same situation because nothing really has changed as far as nutrients deposited or taken up by the forages. So great to see we've almost addressed our nutrient issue, even though that was not one of my resource concerns. Got our blank record-keeping worksheet. And if I wanted to know how to save this, save as, and how to export and print this, I could go back to my instructions tab. Please feel free, if you run into issues, to reach out to me, Brian Campbell, or any of your local grazing specialists. We absolutely want to know if you're running into problems with this new pasture planning tool. You would print this out. This is your implementation requirements. And when you go to certify the practice has been implemented, you would use that new certification sheet. Thank you all for your time. And again, please let me know if you run into issues.